Welcome everybody to the GPE webinar series. My name is Victoria Egbatayo, Partnership Specialist at the Global Partnership for Education. I'm here at the GPE Secretariat in Washington, DC, joined by my colleagues, the GPE webinar team, who've brought you this webinar today. We are also joined by a wonderful panel of experts presenting online from Washington and Cotonou, Benin. The webinar series, which started in 2016, is part of GPE's Knowledge and Innovation Exchange initiative that came about as a response to GPE partner countries' request for additional opportunities to exchange knowledge, good practice and policy approaches that inform education policies, practices at the country level. The webinar also gives practitioners the opportunity to engage in a continuous practice of knowledge exchange between partner countries, which in turn strengthens and fulfills national and global objectives of the GPE. Now that's a bit of an overview of the GPE webinar series, but before we begin this session, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items. If you are facing connection issues, please let us know via @webinars@globalpartnership.org. I'll say that again, @webinars@globalpartnership.org. So please do email that address if you are having connection challenges. We will have a Q&A session after the presentations, so feel free to keep sending your questions through to the webinars via YouTube's live chat feature or by email via the same email address I gave earlier, webinars@globalpartnership.org. We do encourage you to please send your questions to make the session as interactive as possible. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, but please do let us know your name, your organisation and the name of the presenter speaker to whom the questions are directed. That will enable us to ensure that you have the most adequate response possible. The session is also being recorded, and so we'll send everybody participating today resources associated with this webinar and a link to the recorded session. Now on to today's session itself. Today's session is titled Results-Based Financing at GPE, Guidance for Developing Variable Part Grant Applications. Now GPE provides grant funding to countries to support education sector plan implementation. And in 2014, to further incentivise sector plan implementation and drive improvements in equity, efficiency and learning outcomes, GPE introduced results-based financing into its funding model. In most cases, countries applying for the GPE grant funding are required to programme at least 30% of the grant amount at sector level, results-based financing. Based on 3 years of experience with the new mechanism, GPE has compiled a guidance note based on early lessons learned in the design and implementation of the 30% variable part. Now allow me to introduce you to our panellists today. We will also share with you their bios after the session. So let me begin with introducing my colleague, David Balwanz, Senior Education Specialist here at the Global Partnership for Education, who focuses on health and development and is professor and has been professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Also Raoul Atohoun, Technical Permanent Secretary of the Education Sector Plan, Republic of Benin, who's connecting and joining us online. Elias Wakjira, Planning and Resource Mobilization Director at the Ministry of Education, the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. Octavio Medina, Consultant at the Education Global Practice here at the World Bank. And Jessica Lee, Education Specialist at Reach Trust Fund, again here at the World Bank. And our final two presenters will be co-presenting their session. So let me turn now to my colleague David, who will provide the first presentation.
Thank you, Victoria. Since we have 4 presentations today, each of them we're going to try and just be fairly brief. So I'll go ahead and start. Next slide, please. So part of the driving force behind having this webinar was GPE has recently published a guidance note on the variable part, as Victoria mentioned, based on some of our lessons learned and early experiences in using sector-level results-based financing in our funding model. The purpose is simply of this presentation to further explain GPE's approach and also to give some initial thoughts on countries that are applying for this financing. There are a number of countries, I think, between now and the end of 2020, there may be close to 60 applications for grant financing from GPE. A large number of those will include a variable part, and so this guidance note was developed to support the country-level process around that. In terms of the broader objective, behind the variable part or the sector-level results-based financing, it's simply to support country implementation of strategies in their sector plans that seek to drive improvements in equity, efficiency, and learning outcomes in basic education. Next slide, please. Now, I know a number of the webinar participants are quite familiar with GPE, so this is the only slide that provides background on the broader partnership. I just think it's useful to emphasize that our governance structure is through a board with representatives from developing country partners, donor partners, bilaterals, civil society organizations, including teachers' unions, private sector and foundations, and multilateral agencies. And then the governance structure from the board is developed through a number of committees, including our Grants and Performance Committee, which provides either a recommendation or a decision on all SPIG applications that are received through the partnership. The GPE has 3 strategic goals related to equity, efficiency, and learning outcomes, and you'll see those are also reflected in the design of the variable part. Next slide, please. So this actually gets us to the funding model. So in 2014, there was a revision to our funding model. Previously, there was largely only a fixed grant, kind of a normal program grant that would support countries' implementation of their sector plans. The new funding model divides the grant into a fixed part and a variable part. Countries applying for GPE funding, if they meet 3 GPE funding model requirements related to sector planning, domestic financing of education and education data, are eligible for the fixed part of the grant. And then to apply for the variable part of the grant, countries propose implementing transformational ESP strategies that link results-based financing to meeting priority results. For most countries, as Victoria mentioned, the variable part should be equal to no less than 30% of the total grant, and the fixed part is either 70% or slightly less. There is an ex-ante approach, so countries in fragile contexts can apply for to have the variable part requirement waived. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual that kind of speaks to how we look at the variable part at the Secretariat. In the board paper, there's an expectation that countries applying for variable part financing propose DLIs or funding-linked targets in equity, efficiency, and learning outcomes, all 3 dimensions. By equity, we look at issues in access or quality that address disparities across gender, income, disability, region, and a number of other factors related to...
This is the interpreter. I'm so sorry to interrupt the speaker. If you could please slow down just a little bit, we would appreciate it, just to get all the information. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate the guidance. I can have a tendency to speak fairly quickly. So with respect to efficiency, we look at internal efficiency as well as service delivery, value for money types of indicators. And then with respect to learning outcomes, we're looking at proxy outputs or intermediate outcomes that are linked to improving learning. Next slide, please. So I think this may be one of the most important slides because there are many types of results-based financing, and the GPE model is fairly specific, and this will also give you a sense on how, when the Secretariat will receive a concept note or will receive a program document, a draft program document, and are reviewing it for our Grants and Performance Committee. These are some of the criteria that we look at. We look that strategies proposed are at the system level. This reflects kind of the core of sector planning, that sector planning is at the core of our model. We look that strategies be grounded in a robust theory of change with a logical results chain, that there are funding-linked indicators and targets that measure progress in each of the three dimensions, equity, efficiency, and learning outcomes, and that they show an adequate level of ambition, a realistic stretch. And I imagine we might have some, I think some of our other presenters can speak to that, because that is gauging that can be challenging. There should also be a plan for results verification and a disbursement mechanism. So financing can disperse into a pooled fund, into budget support, or it can go back into the project to support project activities. Next slide. Maybe we can skip this one. So this is a new mechanism. So this is the experience thus far, and I think maybe I'll preface this slide as well as we do have our guidelines on the website, and I think the guidelines were sent out in the announcement. So I didn't want to go too deep into the criteria that we use, but we have some reflections on our experience thus far. So far, 21 SPIGs with a variable part have been approved, but no country has closed operations that include a variable part, so it's too early to be talking about impact. However, we do have a number of lessons learned in 6 countries that adopted the variable part in 2015 and 2016. We're also seeing an increased number in the number of applications where programs propose a higher share of the GPE grant be programmed as results-based financing. Next slide. So some of the preliminary lessons learned, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. What country partners have found is if they wait for policy dialogue until the program concept note phase or the draft program design phase, it can significantly delay program development. Our advice, and this is that this discussion be integrated into development of the sector plan. Consultation and debate at the country level are absolutely critical, and they take time. Some of the common challenges we've seen in submitted applications which can delay approval or add additional transaction costs include when proposed targets are not seen as a stretch or maybe direct outputs of the fixed part of the grant. For example, if the fixed part of the grant provides resources to complete 50 classrooms, that can't also be a target within the variable part. The criteria of transformative effect, so if there's not a strong theory of change, or if that change can't be argued to reach at the system level, that's a challenge we see. If a large share of the variable part financing is placed on easy to reach targets, such as if 70% of the financing is placed on the development of a strategy for continuous professional development. That's a very important step in a results chain, but it may not show the adequate level of ambition. And when indicator definitions and disbursement rules aren't clear. Next slide. These are just some strategies for risk management, because it's also true that in a results-based approach, countries do take on additional risk. And there is a desire to balance disbursement with progress toward intermediate outcome and outcome results. Programs can link funding to multiple indicators at process, output, and intermediate levels. Scalable indicators can be used. So instead of saying we're going to reduce dropout by 5%, there can be financing dispersed for every % of dropout that dropout is decreased. And making sure the justification for proposed indicators and targets is clear so that GPE can evaluate the system level influence and stretch. So some of it is just the clear writing in the program document. Last slide. The other thing we're finding, and I think this some of our other colleagues will speak to this, is that results verification often takes more time, more money, and more expertise than is expected. Some of the common challenges include selecting an indicator that's difficult to accurately measure, presenting an unclear or poorly defined target, not including budget for verification activities, and in cases there may be conflicting data or analysis between the ministry sources and an independent verification agent, which can then delay disbursement or even cause the results-based financing to be canceled. So I think I'll stop right there, and I think we can move to the next one. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, David, for that brief overview of GPE, walking us through the variable part and also the experience from the existing lessons learned from the few countries that have gone through it, highlighting the challenges and also the risks. We're now going to move on to the second presentation, which will be a case study. So it will give you more of a flavour of the reality and the experience of actually doing this at the country level, by Raoul Atohoun, Acting Technical Permanent Secretary of the Education Sector Plan, Republic of Benin. Over to you, Mr. Atohoun.
Thank you very much. I am Atohoun Raoul. I am the Permanent Technical Secretariat of the implementation of the Education Sector Plan. I would like to talk to you about the experience we've had in Benin in terms of actually crafting the variable part of the project in GPE. My presentation will consist of 6 points. I will begin by sharing the information I have on the process, how it has worked, and also present the indicators that we retained and the different interventions that led us to achieve our goals. And then we're going to present the process as linked to the different advisory boards and the workshops that we have held throughout this consultation process, and then perhaps recommendations we can share with other countries so that more can be done with what we have achieved in Benin, and then we'll, of course, talk about the challenges that we met during this process. We will have some recommendations in the end as well regarding this process and whether it should be done once again. I'll ask for your indulgence for a couple of minutes just to see if we can get our presentation on the screens. The interpreter points out the speakers in the room are simply talking logistics.
Yes, that's right. If it's helpful, Ms. Atohoun, perhaps you could speak to the presentation and we can share it with the participants after the session.
Okay, so somebody's going to present while the other...
Yes, thank you very much. So as I was saying in my introduction, the first part that we would like to present is on the indicators for the variable part. Given the 3 dimensions that you mentioned earlier and the learning outcomes in Benin, we're able to put in place a system for learning assessment in primary school. In order to reach these goals, there were a few activities that we're able to do, which is the implementation of an assessment unit in one of the primary and secondary schools in order to track this progress. Then we did we're thinking about doing a national assessment on learning outcomes for first grade and for higher levels in French and math. Then as activities, the idea is to hold workshops at the different department level administrations and with teachers and education professionals. In terms of efficiency, the idea is to increase the national goal of students moving on to higher grades and bring their grades up overall. In terms of equity, the idea is to reduce the difference between the teacher-student ratio so that we can have the same or better numbers across the board nationally. In terms of presenting this process started with an initial workshop which was held in June 2018. And it was attended by all of the PSE elaboration stakeholders. And during that workshop, we were able to get a better understanding of how we can identify the indicators we need. The main goal of that workshop was to have a better understanding, as I said earlier, and also to start to begin to describe the variable part indicators. We're working on better defining these indicators and the activities that should go along with them. There were approval sessions that were set up in order to approve the different components of the program, including the variable part, and that took place in November 2018. In terms of what we can recommend to other countries, in the drafting of the sector plan, there needs to be a planning for the variable part that's included with stakeholder ownership in this process. And there needs to be an identification of the indicators that will help to gain the grant from GPE and understand clearly what is the fixed part and the variable part to request. The government cannot provide pre-funding of the variable part, and sometimes it requires a year-long delay of activities to use the variable part resources that are provided so long as the criteria have been met. There needs to be a clarification of the rules to understand exactly what is expected and what can be achieved. And also, there needs to be an identification of the sub-indicators that can help to come closer to reaching the indicators defined. In terms of the specific challenges that we had, we saw challenges in selecting the activities that were the most relevant for reaching the indicators, and in terms of the annual distribution of each indicator's amount. That was another challenge for reaching our goals, and identifying the sub-indicators of the process was another area in which we found challenges for this process. As a recommendations or suggestions, if we were to do this once again, we would, as I said earlier, have to begin earlier to look at the ESP drafting process and make sure that it is clear, and for the concept to be developed by all of the different stakeholders with their ownership, so that we can more easily find the indicators that are going to be included in the project that is going to be presented to the GPE Secretariat for approval. And so in a nutshell, that is what I wanted to present in terms of the experience we had in Benin, in how we developed the variable part program, which was submitted for your approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atohoun, for that very detailed presentation on your experience crafting the variable part in Benin. We're now going to turn over to another country experience on the other side of the continent, from the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopian experience, and this will be presented by Ato Elias Wakjira, Planning and Resource Mobilization Director, Ministry of Education from the Federal Republic of Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you, Victoria, and my appreciation for all participants for these meetings. After having this, let me present a few experience from Ethiopia. I may point out some overviews about the education sector of Ethiopia, and then I'm going to write about result-based financing project, which Ethiopia is implementing starting from September 2016. Ethiopia is one of the poorest country with high population, more than 100 million. Of this, 28 citizens are in education sector currently, and we do have about 39,000 schools who are serving these students, and as well about 700,000 teachers who are teaching these students. For the last couple of years, the government of Ethiopia tried to address education for all, and we achieved UP goals, which we set and committed. And we are also committing to accelerate the implementation of SDG goals in our plans, and our sectoral strategic plan is aligned with this strategy. So now currently we are implementing the fifth education sector development plan, which consequently implemented in the country, which is the foundation and which is the base of all projects and planning issues. So this result-based finance is taken as a support of our SDP 5 projects which we have. When we are designing this result-based finance, we are eligible for 100 million from GP, and of this 70% is for fixed part, and 30% is for variable parts, which as of the plan. And during the implementation, during the inception phase of the project, we set direct what is the objective of this project is. We set an objective that it contributes to improve the learning condition in primary education in targeted region. As it is well known, Ethiopia is a federal country with 9 regions, so we only select a few regions randomly for the implementation of this result-based project, is particularly the variable part of the projects. And from this project objective, we prepared a kind of detailed action plan, how we can achieve this day life, how we are going to improve the learning outcomes by utilizing this the existing budgets into considerations. So detailed guideline, detailed planning were prepared, which was a guide for the implementation of all the project activities is planned to achieve the daily lives which we set this. Ahead of the program, during the design, the management of the Ministry of Education, including the ministers themselves, directly involved in designing of the DLS, which is the beginning of the project. And we involved and consulted a technical working group, which is a platform for government and donors in supporting of the education. So we're looking the advice and the technical supporters from these platforms. As well, we establish a kind of steering committee nationally that can oversee how and what is going to be implemented. In order to consult this, we also establish at different levels task forces that are directly related to each DLIS. Nationally, we set about 5 DLIs based on the learning outcome, equity issues, as well internal efficiency. In order to meet the learning outcome, we select 2 DLIs. The first one is reducing the proportion of lower performing primary schools, level 1 inspection standard in the region with highest share of these schools. Ethiopia has a method or a system of inspecting each school per as the standard which we prepare nationally. So it has 4 levels based on the input, process and the output. So most of the schools are laying under level 1 and level 2. That means they are not conducive for to improve the learning outcome. So we select only one region which has the highest rate of level 1 schools, which is pastoralist area. We call it Afar region as one DLIS. The second DLIS, in order to improve the learning outcome, is that improving the learning environment of all class, pre-primary classes into emerging region by increasing the capacity of all class facilitator to deliver early childhood education and curriculum package. Ethiopia is one of the country which try to implement the pre-primary education, but we are not successful in these areas, which is considered as the missing link for poor quality of the education. So in this project, we consider pre-primary education to be delivered in 1-year program through accelerated kind of curriculum at age of 5 and 6, or maybe at sometimes at age of 4. So we use this variable part as a DLIS to train all class facilitators and to prepare curriculum material for improving of the learning outcome. And for the equity issues, we took again 2 DLIs. The first one is addressing the gender balance in school leadership by increasing the number of trained female primary school principals. So this DLI is also serve us to increase involve the participation of female in leadership position of issue. By increasing this, we enroll a number of students into particularly girls. The second DLI is to address the equity issues, encouraging more inclusive learning environment by increasing school grant allocation to school support special need students. There are citizens who are looking special support from us and disabled citizens. So we consider at least to make school environments more conducive for these citizens. This is also considered as one DLS. For the internal efficiency, reducing the dropout rate by the region with highest grade, as we select for the first DLI for the learning outcome. In order to increase the internal efficiencies, we select one variable related with dropout rate with the highest region. Ethiopia is one of the country with high dropout rate. Now it is an average of 80.5%. So we select one region that are highly affected by these cases, and we make this variable parts. So after selecting this DLS, we conducted a number of consultative meetings with stakeholders. Particularly, we were focusing on classroom, teachers consultative meeting, principal consultative meeting, as well as Warada or provenance education officers training. Intensive training were conducted to build the capacity of the key actors in order to achieve the DLS which we set as a country. So this is the design phase of the project. Then we came to link how the variable parties linked with the fixed parts. In order to consolidate this one, the fixed part, we consider the fixed bus as an additional fund for GKIP project, which is massive funded by multi-donor pool fund systems. And we consider that capacity building programs. And the variable part can complement through these projects, and we tried our best to to create a link between the two parties. That is a good lessons which we took from the implementation of these result-based projects. Then during the design phase again, we also prepared a kind of template for monitoring purposes. And based on that monitoring the tools, we consultatively conducted a training with key implementer of the projects. Even if we succeed in terms of achieving these deadlines, particularly currently we achieved 3 of the deadlines, which I was talking, 100% of them, and the 2 of them are going to be finalized in the coming June. Hopefully, at least we will meet 85% of the deadlines that we set as a target. So these are the lessons, but there is also a challenge in setting and implementing of the variable parts, particularly it is a new modality for Ethiopia, particularly in the education sector. So we took us exercising a project which give us a broad vision how we can achieve and how we can improve the learning outcomes which we are expecting in the SDP 5. So the introduction of this modality as a new into the system is one of the challenges that continuously need a kind of monitoring, consultative meeting, capacity building programs. That is one thing. And the data also, the accuracy and the quality of data was very poor. One, to set the milestone and to also set the target. So that is also another challenge since we are developing a country with limited capacity. So the reliability and the accuracy of data which we were collecting from the IMIS were not as such quality to achieve and to set the required capacity. The other one is capacity limitation at different levels, starting from the federal levels to the school levels. There was a kind of limitations. So in order to mitigate these problems, we consulted and we conducted a number of experience sharing, knowledge sharing with other countries and with also with other sectors, particularly Ministry of Health was one of the line ministers that was implemented. So we took a lesson from such institutions. So lesson learned from this meeting is lesson learned from this, the implementation of this project is continuous awareness creation program should be implemented, consultative meeting, capacity building program should be in place before implementing any project. That is one of the lessons. And improve the involvement of stakeholders. As I have said, regional government were actively participating as the owner of the project. As well, ETW technical.
Could you slow down a little bit?
Oh, sorry. Then the second one is improve the involvement of stakeholder, particularly regional government and the principals at the school levels are key actors for the project implementation phases. So we and technical working group also actively participated in this project. Without the involvement of this stakeholder, it is not possible to think and to decide to achieve the required deadlines which we set. And improve the quality of data in terms of periodical monitoring and regular data has to be connected from the school level to the federal level. That is also one thing which we are taking as a lesson. Then the other one is insightfully looking and outlook each detailed activities and implementation plan. Without a clear role and responsibility, it is not possible to achieve deadlines in terms of improving the learning outcomes. So these are the lessons I want to discuss for this platform.
Thank you so much, Elias, for your presentation. You drew out a number of important issues, and you focused on the participatory process in which you undertook to understand the process in the first place, and also to identify the indicators and the DLI. I also noted the focus you also put in your presentation on the importance of data, the accuracy of the data, the timeliness of the data, and also capacity building, working across sectors to learn from the health sector. So that was quite interesting. And as you said, the importance of having a clear implementation plan to identify the roles and responsibilities of the different actors for the implementation. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to turn now to our colleagues in the World Bank, Octavio and also Jessica, who both have deep experience looking at results-based financing in the education sector from the World Bank, from their various experience and background, both with REACH and also with World Bank projects. I'll now turn over to you.
Great, thank you. So hopefully everyone can hear me. My microphone is working, yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I will quickly, if you could go to the next slide, slide 2, I'll quickly just describe REACH, the REACH Trust Fund. So as many other multilateral organizations, we really love acronyms at the World Bank. So REACH is an acronym for Results in Education for All Children. We are a multi-donor trust fund funded by the governments of Germany, Norway, and the United States. And really the objective of the trust fund is to generate evidence around results-based financing, specifically in the education sector. As Victoria was alluding, this has been done in the health sector. And there was great interest from our donors to sort of try to see what types of evidence we could both develop ourselves and sort of generate in other countries to understand the experience in the education sector much better. You can go to the next slide, please. So in REACH, we have a number of available resources. These are all, most of them are available on our website, which the presentation will be shared and you can have access to the link. One of them is a library of disbursement linked indicators. So this is specific to World Bank projects, but there are over, I think, 300 DLIs that are listed in this library without judgment. So we don't say whether we think the DLI is a good one or a bad one, but it's really a way for teams to see examples of different DLIs that have been used in various World Bank projects with RBF components. We also recently completed a review, Octavio and myself, that is basically called Learning from What Works. And it is essentially, we've sort of nicknamed it a compendium of information about results-based financing in education, specifically about design and implementation issues. A note on this, it was done very much from a multilateral sort of donor perspective or a bilateral donor perspective. We surveyed different task team leaders who work in other agencies such as GPE, such as the Asian Development Bank, such as the IDB, so other organizations that have some of their financing that flow in results-based ways. We try to survey those individuals. But we are undertaking work in REACH to look more at the country level perspective, which we think is very important. And, as you've heard from both presenters in Benin and Ethiopia, that experience should be captured in some way. And then in addition, we provide technical assistance primarily so far to World Bank teams who are designing and implementing projects that have results-based components. But certainly we are available, for questions, particularly around specific types of interventions, which I'll briefly touch on. You can move to the next slide. A lot of our focus, I think it might just be delayed for me. So is it possible to go to the next slide, or do you already see it? Okay, thank you.
Yes, there's a slight time delay.
Yeah, no, I understand, sorry. So I think the main focus of this particular presentation will be on the review that Octavio and myself conducted, mostly because we did a lot of analysis on the DLIs, and I think that would be of particular interest to the audience here. But just to give an overview of how the review is structured, we really looked at sort of the 4 primary levels or stakeholders in the education system that are most often incentivized. So that would be teachers, which look at sort of teacher incentive design. So if you're interested in learning more about what is the larger literature around teacher incentives, we have a section on that. We have a section on incentives to students and families. So families being kind of traditionally what people understand to be conditional cash transfers, looking at the body of literature that has been written on that. And then REACH itself has funded some evaluations on the effects of directly incentivizing students, which have had some interesting results. And then in terms of schools, so these are mostly looking at performance-based school grants. So we know that school grants have been used historically in many, many countries, and now there's an orientation to make them more performance-based and more results-based. And we have, REACH has funded some studies that look at the effects of those types of grants, and also looking at some of the design issues. And then I think what we will focus on today is sort of what has been maybe classically called results-based aid, which is looking at sort of results-based financing directly to governments, so that donor-government relationship. You can move to the next slide and then actually maybe just skip to slide 6. I think that will make it faster. So in terms of RBF and governments, there isn't a lot of, I guess, what you would call academic literature available in this area. So a lot of what we collate in the review was looking at sort of the survey that we conducted of multilateral agency staff and bilateral agency staff, in addition to doing sort of more in-depth interviews with people who are practitioners of results-based financing. So we have this section in the review sort of structured in 3 different parts. The first is even deciding to use RBF and sort of the different criteria that countries and task team leaders would want to consider. The first being political commitment. Obviously, it's very important. I think this is true for any financing instrument and not just results-based financing, but I think it is something that we often overlook, and we assume, that everybody in the country is on the same page, that everyone has a similar understanding. So I think that commitment is important, and to generate that political will. The second is cost effectiveness. This may not be, I think this may be more from the donor side of things, but really looking at, is results-based financing something that is getting value for money, for example? There's not a lot of evidence that that is true, but I think there's interest in pursuing sort of more research on that side. The third is cautions, or what we would call risks. I think we were just trying to find, words that started with C, but certainly one of the biggest risks that countries face is the financial risk of not having funds being dispersed. So for example, if you don't reach a target, what happens? Or if you don't have the money upfront to help you reach that target, how are there mitigation methods in place? At the bank, we have, the possibility of an advance. I'm not as familiar with the GPE variable part, but there, other organizations have other types of risk mitigation mechanisms. Then the last one on the choosing RBF side would be just considering the context, the country context, of course, being very important in terms of both capacity and country systems. So just a note about capacity, I don't think we ever want to associate low income with being low capacity. I think that's actually not true, and we've seen countries that are very low income successfully implement results-based financing. I think it's more just about, and this is something that Victoria was sort of summing up from Mr. Wakjira's presentation, it's really about making sure that all different levels within the country understand how the results-based financing scheme works. And that communication is incredibly important so that people feel that the process has been transparent and that they understand how the incentives are working. In terms of country systems, I think the 2 most important country systems in results-based financing are the EMIS, the Education Management Information System, and the FM, the Financial Management System. And I think David was alluding to this when he was talking about, being able to identify disbursement mechanisms. So we've definitely had cases and World Bank projects where people wanted incentives to go down to a certain level, but realized there was no way, that certain schools don't have bank accounts, for example. So how are you going to actually get the money to schools? Or how can you trust that, I think some people have tried, we are going to send the money then to the principal, but then how do you check to make sure that the principal then is using the funds for appropriate reasons? So then moving on, in terms of planning and design, I think, again, Mr. Wakjira sort of alluded to this, but the idea that you would cascade incentives. So, I think we can all relate from, hearing stories about the Ministry of Education being held responsible for something, but the Ministry of Finance being reimbursed for those results. and making sure that those cascades really flow down to the people who are responsible for achieving the targets. Again, I think this is tied to the communication, really communicating the incentive scheme and making sure that there's transparency around that so that people aren't trying to game the system or that they don't feel like they weren't or they feel that they weren't consulted. And then the next point in terms of that, and I think where we'll center most of the discussion, is on the selecting and pricing of indicators. So this is very much, I think, what we would call both a science and an art. It's very difficult to say what a good DLI looks like because it's very dependent on the country context, and we've seen examples just now from Benin and Ethiopia. But I'm going to let my colleague Octavio speak more to this because we did do an analysis of the 300 plus DLIs that have been used in World Bank projects. And so we can sort of give a little bit of an overview of kind of the characteristics of those DLIs.
Great. Thanks, Jess. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so as Jess mentioned, I'm going to focus a bit more on the actual DLI analysis, which was a part of the section we did in our report on RBF and governments. So can we move to the next slide, please? So if you think that choosing indicators is hard, you're definitely not alone. In the survey that we did with our sample of practitioners and development workers, we found that choosing indicators was, in fact, the challenge that was most frequently mentioned when we asked people what they thought was the biggest challenge for designing an RBF intervention. So of course, there's a reason for this, right? It's that choosing indicators is not easy. And can we move on to the next slide? And one of the main reasons for this is that you can make an indicator out of pretty much anything. So in the sample that we analyzed, that as Jess said, is over 300 DLIs from the past, I want to say almost 10 years, over 10 years now. There's DLIs on inputs. You can build a DLI around supplying textbooks. You can build a DLI around assessment or administering an exam. You can build a DLI around more quality assurance measures such as accreditation procedures or performance benchmarks. You could even design a DLI around learning outcomes, like we've heard in some of the previous presentations. You can, have employment or test scores be DLIs. So I think this is part of the reason why it can be a bit daunting to start designing a project, because where do you start, right? So despite all this diversity of options and topics, we did find some trends in our DLI. So if we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so for example, we found that the average DLI was around $18.8 million, so around 20 million. So of course, there's a lot of variation within the cost of DLI. So the lowest 25% of DLIs are $12 million or less. And the highest 25%, the highest quartile, are 40 million or more. But there's tiny DLIs. There's DLIs that are 0.5 million, and there's DLIs that are enormous. I think our highest DLI in our database was over $340 million, and I think was a P4R project, and it was linked to learning outcomes. So there's huge variation in this that depends on the characteristics and features of each case and of each project. In terms of the number of DLIs that you have per project, there's more stability. Things are more, actually, well, before switching to the number, let me just say that despite the fact that there's a lot of variation within the cost of DLIs, there is a number of systems that we found that teams used to distribute or to allocate the cost to DLIs. One of them is very easy. We call it a heuristic because it basically consists of getting the amount for your project and distributing it equally amongst all DLIs. So have there be, if you have $100 million and 5 indicators, 2020, 2020, 2020. And the reason teams do that is that, first of all, it's quite simple and straightforward. And second, it's scary to have to concentrate funds amongst very few DLIs because you're putting all your eggs in one basket. which is a topic that was mentioned in previous presentations, right? You don't want to find a situation where if you miss one DLI, you suddenly lose 75% of the financing for your project. So if you just allocate DLI equally, then at least you spread the risk and you also focus interest and attention on a number of things. But there's other systems. I mean, some teams also choose to allocate costs based on the perceived value or the significance of a DLI, right? If you really think that a DLI is the key to unlocking the rest of your results framework, then you may allocate more to that DLI to signal that you think that that is important, regardless of the actual cost of the DLI. And finally, you can also, just use costs as a guide, which is also quite a common way of allocating value to DLIs. So moving on to the number of DLIs, there's around 6 per project is the average we found. The lowest 25% had 5 or less, and the highest had 9 or more. So I mean, there's variation, but not as much as for the amount of each DLI. And the reason is that once you don't want a results framework that is too tangled up and too complicated, because you, as Jess said previously, a key thing is for incentives to cascade and for everyone involved in the project to actually understand what is going on and what the priorities are. So if you have 50 DLIs, then you're going to probably run into trouble because people are not even going to be able to know what is important, what they should focus on. So it's about reaching the sweet spot, which, as Jess said, is an art, not a science. Also, we found that 95% of financing in projects is results-based, so that leaves only 6% that is not, and that is allocated to things like TA. So despite the fact that overwhelmingly most of the financing is results-based, we did find that TA is crucial, and I think it's a topic that's also been mentioned by some of the other presenters, because sometimes, especially for things that that require overhauling a system or big changes, you're going to need that TA, and it's important to think of where that is going to fit within your project. And finally, we also found that most of the DLIs were intermediate outcomes. There are some caveats to this that we're going to talk about in the next slide. Okay, so there's a couple of interesting things about this. This is the number of disbursement indicators, the percentage by the results chain position. So as you can see, there's a huge majority of them are intermediate outcomes. But it's also surprising to see that quite a few DLIs are inputs and process indicators, right? Which, I mean, since the R in RBF stands for results, you may ask, well, why is that the case? And the answer is pretty simple. I mean, I'm sure everyone is aware that a lot of outcomes and a lot of intermediate outcomes require previous things. So if you need to build on those previous things, as Jess said, there's procedures like 0 DLIs that get disbursed even before the targets are met, and other easier targets that make it easier for the borrower or for the recipient to make progress. Because it's not worth it to have a massive DLI for an outcome if you can't finance everything that's along the way to reach that outcome. So that's why teams have found it quite useful to allocate different amounts of money to inputs and processes, despite it being RBF. And the reason intermediate outcomes are so massive is that, well, partly it's a problem of the nomenclature, right? We decided to stick to a strict definition of final outcome, so we're just treating learning outcomes and employment as our outcomes, because otherwise we found that it gets a little bit complicated. So what we saw is that teams are a little bit skeptical. They'd rather not. More often than not, they don't do DLIs with learning outcomes or employment because it's hard. You don't have total control over the indicators. And we found that it's useful to choose in DLIs where you feel people are confident that they can have an impact and they can actually modify the results. Because if you feel you're helpless, then there's no point. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Hello? Is there a lag?
Yeah, it's gonna be.
Oh, there you go. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, there's a role for each of the for DLIs in every position. Even inputs, which is traditionally not something that you would associate with RBF, may play a role. And we saw examples of all of these categories in our database. We saw textbooks being procured or delivered for as an example of inputs. I think processes play a particularly important role in a lot of RBF operations because many things like updating a curriculum or creating an agency or implementing an exam, all of those things that are things that may cost not that much money are still very important and are not outcomes, but they're key pieces in any results chain. So they're crucial. And yeah, I mean, intermediate outcomes is basically anything that falls between with an output or until a final outcome. And can we move on to the next slide? So we also asked our practitioners and development experts what they thought should be incentivized. And we actually found that it was broadly similar, at least in order, with what we saw and how the DLIs were allocated, right? Of course, the less frequently cited option was inputs because it is RBF, but still half of them thought they were worth creating DLIs around. And the most frequently cited one is intermediate outcomes, which is what we saw in the actual data. And just very quickly, I think we're gonna skip the next slide just because I think Dave mentioned the different kinds of ways of allocating money. So this is just an example of what a results chain can be, or what a DLI can be, that sort of incorporates all the themes we've been mentioning over the past couple of slides. You know, we have it's built around one topic, which is the primary completion exam, and it starts with a baseline with the completion exam being implemented, and then it builds slowly upon that baseline, but in an attainable way that is still significant. You also have different kinds of DLIs. For example, you include some process DLIs where you have to implement a 5-year action plan in year 0, but you also have more intermediate outcome DLIs towards year 3, for example, where you have the exam is completed and the results are disseminated by NDP and NAPICHAR to Bangladeshi agencies. So it's a nice way of showing how you sort of need all of these components to have a successful result chain with DLIs. And finally, I'm gonna leave it to Jess to make the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Octavio. So to Octavio's point in terms of selecting and pricing indicators, I think again, this is data that we've analyzed using World Bank projects, and certainly there's a lot of variation between those projects, and these are just some of the trends that we've been able to identify. And then I think the other presenters have also touched on sort of the final part of this story, which is the implementation side, which is where things also can be very challenging, especially around monitoring and verification. I think this has been mentioned that upfront verification costs can be very expensive. I think they've even said, to kind of plan in the budget for the cost of that. I think what tends to happen is the first round of verification is often done by third-party, independent, sometimes international firms, which can be incredibly costly. But there often is some benefit to investing in that verification upfront if you also partner the firm with a national body. So we've seen examples again in projects where they've hired a firm to come and do the initial verification, but they've coupled that with technical assistance to, maybe a semi-autonomous body within the country, either a statistics unit. We've also seen it done with universities, maybe with the economics department in a university, to really strengthen the national capacity to actually monitor and verify. In Nepal, we actually saw there was a DLI tied to the verification and validation of the EMIS system. And once that was done, then now the Nepali government has a very trustworthy system that they can rely on, especially since they just underwent a heavy decentralization reform. Of course, there are always concerns also of the gaming and cheating, though we don't actually see much evidence of this. I think, probably because there hasn't been a specific research focus on it by any group to actually look at it. I think the most common thing that happens that's not necessarily gaming or cheating is just that countries direct their attention solely to the DLIs and they forget about some of the other indicators in the results framework. So again, I think that's just the delicate balance of having to identify, what are the critical results that we're looking for and what needs to, sort of looking through the entire results chain and incentivizing key points, but ensuring that other parts of the results chain are also met. And then something that I think we've been really emphasizing from our side again is just the technical assistance and quality of implementation. So again, if you choose an output such as X number of teachers will be trained, you also want to make sure that there's quality behind that teacher training, that that those teachers are going to be better prepared, that they're preparing better lesson plans, for example, that they're using the training in some way. And those are often difficult to measure, but I think through technical assistance, from donor partners, that you can make DLIs that often seem more output focused, have more of those quality dimensions. So those are really the main points that we wanted to make. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Octavio and Jessica, for that overview of your review of different results-based financing in the education sector, and highlighting the importance of looking at the entire results chain, as you said, and the quality of the technical assistance to support implementation. You also made important points around ensuring that there's strong communication and transparency in the entire process, that different stakeholders sort of understand their roles and responsibilities, and that can also help to some extent the cascading of the incentives. And you also mentioned countries also working with national institutions as part of capacity building, be they academic institutions, statistics units in the Bureau of Statistics, etc. And I think those are important elements to highlight. And thank you, Octavio, for going through the DLI, the different DLIs that are selected, and the processes that are involved in that selection process and your findings around that. We're going to move now to the Q&A, and we have quite a number of questions from participants online. The webinar stimulated a lot of excitement and reaction from participants. So I just want to encourage those who are online to keep posting your questions, and we will try our best to make sure that there are responses to all of those. And please do include your name and your institution. There's a quick point of clarification from Jean-Jacques, who's with an organisation called Ideas, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jean-Jacques, and he asked for clarification with regard to the DLI library that was mentioned by Jessica, and I think from our side the clarification may be that the DLI library is available on the REACH website, and that will be shared by email after the session. So that's just a point of clarification. There's a question from Augustine Campbell, not sure of the institution or the organisation. Great presentation by Jessica on RBF. However, how RBF is applied to students and families, as highlighted in your presentation, pointing to their role and responsibilities within the RBF. What is that? Basically, what is the role of the community within the RBF process? That's the first question, and that's to REACH.
Okay, sure. So thank you for your question. Let me try to be maybe more clear on how we identify it in the report. And Octavio, please feel free to jump in as well. So when we look at students and families, as I was saying, we mostly were looking at the literature around what has been traditionally known as conditional cash transfers. Certainly, I think that's mostly around, incentives that are directed to parents. So, saying that if you send your daughter to school, for example, we will give you some sort of voucher or subsidy. What REACH has done is we've also tried to fund evaluations that look specifically at incentivizing students directly. So we have a grant in Mozambique that looked at sort of whether or not in-kind incentives, so not direct financial incentives, but in-kind incentives.
I'm sorry, the interpreter wants to highlight there is sound coming from another microphone that is cutting out the speaker's voice, and I believe in a different room there may be a microphone on, capturing all of the movement.
Should I continue?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the evaluations that we funded was looking at the in-kind incentivization of girls to attend secondary school to basically reduce dropout, which was found to be relatively successful. So, and I don't think there's been as much literature on what happens when you actually directly incentivize students to participate in education. In terms of community participation, though, I think actually this is this has been used the most in schools. So school management committees, school-based management systems, usually with school grants. So Indonesia has a very long history of using school grants with school management committees, and those school management committees are meant to provide inputs on what the community thinks is important for education. I think this varies between countries because in some countries parents have lower levels of education and they themselves may not really understand what a quality sort of school setting looks like. And that requires, again, a lot of outreach and communication to kind of inform them of their roles. I think, for example, there was an evaluation done separate from REACH in the Gambia that saw that parental participation still required more training than just assuming that parents knew exactly what they wanted to get out of the school. And I think in performance-based school grants, there's even been some use of the community to monitor the funds. So as I was saying before, you know, if a school gets funds, in Indonesia, it's quite programmed. In other places, you know, schools get just a bonus where they can use the money for almost anything. And so having communities sort of accountability to ensure that those funds are being used for the proper things, you know, that a lot of times you see, oh, the school spent a lot of money on landscaping or gardens, which is, you know, of course, very lovely and very nice, but not so much if the school is actually missing vital resources like textbooks or supplemental reading materials, or if the school doesn't have latrines or toilets for girls and things like that. But Octavio, I don't know if you want to tag on to that.
Yeah, and I think you covered pretty much everything. I was just going to say that, I mean, if the person who asked the question is interested in looking at more evidence, I think we cite quite a few papers in the RBF and schools mainly section on community-based interventions, because, I mean, yeah, as Jess said, there's, especially in Indonesia, quite a few of those.
Response to the question. There is also a question to Mr. Atohoun from Benin. The question is, what was the involvement of local civil society in the verification process? And that is also from Jean-Jacques. Perhaps as our colleagues from Benin address their connection issues, maybe I can actually address the question to you, Elias.
Yeah, thank you for the verification process. I didn't touch it in my presentation, but we do have a good experience. It is an independent entity that is selected or commissioned to make the verification processes. In our context, this result finance is commissioned for Central Statistic Agency, since all of our data are directly or indirectly related to the data system. So in the verification process, we report for the World Bank, which is a grant agent for this project, and the World Bank sent our report for the verifying agencies, for central agency. After the verification report, the verification report has to be presented for ETWG group, technical working group, which is composed of donors, the civic society, local NGOs, as well as government representative. Particularly in our cases, teachers, Ethiopian Teacher Association is a part of that, and civic society by selecting a representative from them through the consultation of other civic society. So in that platform, they have a right to raise any issues and involvement. So starting from the designing phase up to the verification process, civic society and donors are highly engaged in our process.
Thank you. Actually, maybe I'll turn the question also to you, David. Is it a requirement for countries to involve civil society as they craft the variable part from a GPE standpoint?
Yeah, no, thank you, Victoria. No, so with the focus on the sector planning process and the link between the variable part and the process of sector planning, there's certainly a role and a requirement that there be a local education group in which a civil society is represented in supporting the development and consultation over the sector plan, as well as a role in the endorsement. The sector plan is endorsed at the country level, and the local education group is part of that. In addition, during the design year, sometimes there's a second iteration of design building on the sector plan that would go through the program design process, that also the coordinating agency and the leg and civil society would play a role, as well as kind of a third stage when results are verified, while the grant agent has the legal responsibility to validate the results prior to disbursement. Our guidelines also include an expectation that the verification report be shared with the leg in the event that there are differences of interpretation.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, David. We also have a question from Ira Kita, a learning specialist and consultant in Brussels. How do you choose the standards regarding best practices? For example, Jessica Lee mentioned better lesson plans from local teachers. Where can I find these standards? That's a question to our colleagues from REACH.
Sure. So I think that's, again, a good question, but also very country context dependent in terms of standards for these types of things. Certainly at the World Bank, we have been trying to collect resources from our different teams, again, in particular around performance-based school grants and trying to gather the different types of school manuals that we have, trying to identify, if there are commonalities, but certainly, unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you. I think that's something that would have to be done in consultation at the country level in terms of, what the curriculum department is doing, what the teacher training centers are doing, and coming up sort of with an in-country standard rather than something that is, international. But if anyone has any other comments on that, please feel free to jump in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jessica. I'll go back to the question on civil society for our Benin colleagues in case they are connected. How is local civil society involved in the variable parts process in Benin? Are you able to respond, colleagues from Benin?
Yes, we can hear you and we are connected. Thank you. Going back to the variable part and how we did this in Benin, when we started this process, we set up a committee, a broad committee including technical and financial partners, as well as CSOs. Apart from this committee, we were also able to get strong participation from civil society. We have the leg as well, which approves the various phases of project development. specifically when it comes to the variable part. Civil society is also an active member of the leg, which, as I said, approves the outcomes of the project. So that's what I wanted to say about civil society participation when we were developing the variable part of our program in Benin. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues in Benin. There's another question from Marc-Antoine on indicators on equity. It will be necessary to ensure better distribution of teachers at the national level to reduce disparities among communes across the country. Apart from the planned recruitment of almost 3,600 new teachers, the proposed strategy will be based primarily on the assignment of the newly hired teachers to underdeserved communes to address the existing disparities. Could you please indicate how the priority commune to be targeted was selected? Was it based on data or on consultations? And what data did you use to select those communes? Was this process challenging in any way? How does this constitute a stretch in the context of Benin? And I'm happy to repeat the questions to our colleagues in Benin.
Thank you very much. My name is Marino Gomez. I am the Assistant Director for Programming at the Ministry of Preschool and Primary Education. We were able to identify those areas where there is more need, disadvantaged or underserved areas. We did this using school data. That was our statistical basis, and we focused on primary education. We were able to take a look at all of the different towns or communes where the teacher-to-student ratio was under the national average. Again, under the national average. That was the criterion that we used to identify those areas where the ratio was under the national average. That helped us develop our methodology and determine the teaching needs in those different areas, those communes. Again, those that had a teacher-to-student ratio under the national average. And that was our general approach. But I'm going to give the floor to my colleague to add to that. Yes, I'd just like to add that for that specific indicator, we were able to measure cases beneath the national average, and we also identified areas where the ratio was the highest. The student-to-teacher ratio was the highest. The objective was to reduce the gap, essentially, between those towns that have a lot of teachers and those that do not. We wanted to reduce the gap. So we focused on 8 sites. We wanted to make sure that this gap was reduced. 8 points, excuse me, to make sure that that gap was not greater than 8 points. Thank you. That was what we wanted to say.
Thank you. And actually building on the discussion around data in response to the equity question, but also building on what you said, Elias, that it's important to have accurate data and that this was a challenge. To what degree do both Ethiopia and Benin work with the Bureau of National Statistics in this RBF process? And if not now, is it envisaged in the future? Maybe I'll start with you, Octavio.
Yeah. In Ethiopia, we consider image data per annum, annually collected from the schools and used for planning purpose, for decision, as well as for designing of a project. But it captures only basic informations. When we are setting this specific kind of DLIs, it needs specific kind of monitoring and data collection systems. It may not be expected to be absolute data, but at least it has to fulfill the minimum standards. For instance, in one of our DLIs deal about dropout rate. So in order to reduce this dropout rate timely, it needs a continuous collection of data, analyzing of the data, and using that data for intervention areas. That is one case which we are facing in our cases. Behind that, there are some unexpected or uncertainty that are coming into during the implementation phases. For instance, in this DLI's implementing regions, we faced a kind of drought and flood. So that directly, if we don't capture a data, it is not possible to intervene and to minimize these risks. So we use as a data, we have data, image data, but it is DLIs or variable part particularly need a kind of continuous flow of data from the grassroots level to ministries level.
Mm-hmm. And so the Bureau of National Statistics, does it play a role in your crafting of the variable part? Has
Yes.
it, or in the future?
Yes, yes.
And colleagues from Benin?
Yes, thank you for the question. In Benin, we do have an annual census, so to speak, that is carried out every year. And we are able to collect information every year. We also have a database within the various ministries in charge of education. So we do have data. Data is processed, and we have a database. It doesn't seem then that we have an issue producing data within the Ministry of Education. We are able to use our data to make predictions, to forecast, and to determine the needs of the various areas that we're trying to serve. But I'll let my colleague add to that as well. Yes, we also work on this within the Ministry of Secondary Education. But let me talk more about the National Bureau of Statistics. We have a National Institute of Statistics, which is in charge of approving the methodology that we put in place for collection of data and for processing of data. So the National Institute requires us to come to them in order to get approval for the methodology we choose for data collection. That's their involvement. The Institute also gives us access to certain statistics and data once our methodology has been approved. We can also go to the Institute to get population data and to have access to their population data projections. That also helps us determine the enrollment rate and various indicators for which we need to use population data. So that's how we work with the National Institute of Statistics in Benin. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here, or rather a point of clarification. Jessica, rather Octavio, mentions the importance of spreading the risk by pricing multiple indicators. But I think in Benin's presentation, this risk was highlighted, or this area was highlighted as a risk, spreading financing across multiple indicators. So it seemed a bit of a contradiction between the two. So maybe Octavio, you can begin with your response. And if I didn't hear correctly, Benin, I apologize.
Yeah, sure. So actually, well, as just mentioned, we weren't really trying to say what the best practices are, because, I mean, they really aren't, or we don't at least have guidelines for that. It was just that it's a behavior we observed, and some of the TTLs did mention that was their way of beating risk. Because if you concentrate DLIs and the financing in just one or two DLIs, and that DLI is not scalable, it's just a yes or a no, then if you miss it, it can be a big issue. So maybe it's not in contradiction with what our colleagues in Benin were saying.
Colleagues in Benin, I don't know if you'd like to respond.
The interpreter just was rephrasing that question, repeating the question for Benin. Well, I don't know if there was perhaps a misunderstanding, but with the program that we have, it wasn't so much an issue of distributing the financing across the indicators. What I meant to say was that you might have a flow. If you have 2 million for an indicator, how do you distribute that over a given year across activities? But we were able to understand that this could be complicated, so we decided to adopt the principle of proportionality. So if you have 60% and you have to go up to 80% for a given period for a given DLI, in the first year, the indicator maybe gets up to 70%. So it was the idea of proportionality for the indicators across the years, not necessarily concentrating activities just in one DLI as opposed to another. So that's how we proceeded for the indicators that we chose and that we were able to calculate using that proportional methodology. We also established sub-indicators, and we were able to look at the activities that could be carried out and the results we could achieve. And that was how we were able to arrive at the amounts for the various indicators too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for participating to the webinar session this morning, both all the presenters and also the participants online with your questions. There are still quite a lot of questions that were put forward to us for the session, but we do have to wrap up now. But we'll do our best to try to see how to provide a response to some of those questions and circulate those responses along with the other materials. So just to quickly summarize what we took from this session. The variable part for GPE is still new in terms of being implemented. It's relatively new within the education sector more broadly, and there's a lot to learn also from the health sector. Emphasis was placed on the importance of participation, communication, having a transparent process, trying to avoid gaming the process, the importance of timely and accurate data, and working with various national agencies and institutions, particularly around the verification of those of the indicators, a capacity building in that context as well, and also the importance of drawing lessons from the countries themselves as to how this is working and the experience of crafting the indicators and the experience of actually trying to achieve the targets set by each country and context. So I'd like to thank everyone once again for joining us this morning, and we'll see you next time for the next GPE webinar series. Thank you. Bye-bye.